All right, good evening and welcome everyone. And thank you for joining us tonight for the session Keeping Men in Mind for Men's Health Week. For those who don't know me, my name's Maddie and I'm the Health Promotion Officer at Monash Council. Tonight, this event is in partnership with Boroondara, Knox, Kingston, Manningham, Maroondah and Whitehorse councils. I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all zooming in from today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. And I'm meeting on the Monash lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong people, and I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm very pleased to welcome our guest for this evening's event, Dr. Zach Seidler. Zach is a clinical psychologist, researcher, and leading men's mental health expert. Zach has dedicated his academic and professional career towards further understanding men's mental health and masculinity. His ultimate goal is to help reduce the staggering rates of male suicide and domestic violence worldwide. He has advocated for change in the way we think about treating men's distress. As part of his research, he has uniquely focused on creating mental health services that account for masculinity. So we acknowledge that tonight's topics may be sensitive and challenging or confronting to some people. So please take care of yourselves. And if at any point you need to leave the webinar, please do so. I'll have my colleague put some support services in the chat now that you can access. And we also have Zach here to assist if required as well. So Zach is here to take us through ways of understanding and responding to men who may be or are experiencing distress. He will explore how masculinity and mental health interacts, what to look for, and the importance of speaking to men in your life who might be struggling. So thank you for being here, Zach, to help us navigate this topic. And during the presentation, if you have any questions you would like to ask, please pop it in the Q&A chat section and we'll address them in our Q&A debrief at the end. So I'll hand over to you now, Zach. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie, and great to be here. Thank you everyone for coming and putting aside your time this evening. It's great to be able to hopefully share some insights with you about my work. I come to you from the Moustache Factory, which is in Richmond, just up the road, Movember. And despite what others may think, we actually do work all year round. I have a beard for the rest of the year, but thanks to my partner's hatred of my moustache. But there is so much work going on in this space in Australia. Lots of it is obviously focused in Melbourne, and we work in 21 countries across the globe. So I'll be sharing my insights that I've kind of gleaned over the past decade or so working in this space. It's never has there been a more pressing time to think about men's mental health, to talk about men and masculinity, and young men, especially in our next generation, of how we're going to go about considering engaging with them, finding ways to connect and uplift and build capacity, because we are really facing a very difficult time in our culture at the moment, and in the way that media and education and the health system, all of this is kind of interacting. It's really important that we find ways to come together, understand one another's experiences, and make sure that we are actually looking after each other in the best ways possible. So I want to take a moment, given that we are going to be talking about men's mental health and male suicide more broadly, to just take a moment to reflect on all those lives that we've lost. We talk about the ripple effect in the suicide prevention space. We lose 7 men a day to suicide in Australia. And for each one of those men, we know, the research tells us, that there's over 130 people who are directly affected, whether it's family members or friends or colleagues, it doesn't matter. The impact and the long running grief that kind of follows that is immense for many. So anyone who is here today with lived experience, I am coming to you with my own lived experience of suicide loss in my family. It's something that drives me. It's something that makes me want to continue to push towards answers and understanding in this space. And so I want to thank everyone for putting aside the time tonight, for bringing your experience, your questions, hopefully, towards the end, and to just reflect on the fact that we're talking about the people in our lives. We're talking about, the experiences that we've had, and that is an immense privilege in some ways, and also comes with a burden. So I will always be here to chat about this stuff, either at the end of this webinar or by email as well. So we're going to be talking about quite a charged, complex topic in men and masculinities and mental health. Masculinity is a term that is bandied around a lot at the moment, and I'll talk about the current circumstance that we're in when it comes to this alarmist narrative about masculinity and how it's in a crisis and how everything's kind of broken. So when it comes to the questions, I obviously want people's thoughts and opinions, but if we can just always keep open-minded and respectful, that'd be great. So the status quo. We're dealing with some pretty full-on statistics here, and they haven't shifted despite organizations like Movember or Headspace or Beyond Blue. Australia is leading the way in the mental health game here. We have incredible research and services. Obviously, we want more and better quality. But despite all of this, men make up 75% of suicide deaths, and we are losing globally a man a minute to suicide. The fact that 75% of deaths by suicide are men makes me always consider suicide a largely gendered phenomenon, which is that many women attempt suicide. There is a lot of distress and depression and anxiety that goes on amongst women. The prevalence rates are much higher. But when it comes to suicidal death, it is far greater amongst men. And there's a number of reasons for that, around the ways in which men are socialized, the way in which their mental health and distress is responded to, which we'll speak to in a sec, the way that services kind of understand and treat men's distress, and also the fact that it actually happens and in pretty unique ways, in ways that aren't mental health specific, and that situational stresses like financial distress and relationship breakdown are actually much stronger risk factors for suicide than a history of depression, for instance. So we need to be looking out for the fact that many guys are actually having this crying out for help in certain circumstances where we might not be seeing them as mental health, situations. In fact, we, come in with all different services and responses when in fact, what they really require is, a compassionate ear to really sit down with them and discuss their distress. So everyone talks about the fact that men don't seek help. That's a narrative that has been around forever. There are two famous German psychologists who in the 90s, their names are Angst and Ernst. Angst is a very funny name for someone in this field, but they wrote, "Women seek help and men die." And it was one of the first papers that I ever read in the field. It was something that really drew me to this field because it had this morose inescapability. It was just like, this is how it is. And I didn't buy it. And so I spent, much of my early career and throughout my PhD really focusing on, do men not seek help and why? And it became abundantly clear that many men are seeking help, more men than ever before. That is not to say that we have, reached capacity with the number of men that are seeking help, but so many men are, and it's not working. It's falling on deaf ears, and we are still seeing that suicide rate remain stagnantly high. If our services are really hitting the mark, then we should be seeing serious drops in suicide, rates. So I continued to start to go, wait a second, there must be stuff that's going on in our society, stuff that's going on in our health system that is not actually responding to, they're not reaching, responding, and retaining men in care. And I'm sure that anyone on this call who has, experienced mental health difficulties themselves has understood that, seeing a therapist like myself is kind of like dating. You need to try out a number of different people to see what works for you. But that situation of like, trying different things and seeing what works, that conversation is not really common within society. And so there's this expectation that everything should work immediately. And there's also not enough conversation around expectation setting. And so men are dropping out of treatment prematurely. So over 60% of men who die by suicide have sought help in the year prior. They are within our reach. And there are so many men, even if we're not talking about suicidality, if we're talking about PTSD veterans, if we're talking about panic attacks in young men, there is so much contact with the health system that really is not actually leading to better outcomes across the board. And that's something that really concerns me. But we need to break down myths first and foremost. We need to get to the bottom of all of these stereotypes that abound that are really, really not useful and are actually putting us back into this self-fulfilling prophecy, which is that men are a certain way. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus crap, which is just so harmful. And the health system will just perpetuate these things if we don't challenge them. So we've started to do some research and look into what are men's actual experiences. The fact that in 2016 or 17, I did the first study in the world asking men with depression what treatment was like, what was therapy like for you, was so astounding to me that no one had done that before, but kind of speaks to the serious vacuum here in evidence that we're trying to break down. So men don't self-refer, not true. It's the most common referral pathway. Men feel ashamed going to therapy. Of course, there are certain groups of men who might feel this way. If, there's trauma histories, there's sexual abuse histories, there's really, a lot of complexity that goes on here. But largely when men have made the call to go to therapy, the vast majority feel little shame. Men aren't motivated to attend therapy. Well, in fact, if you provide them with something that they want, if you ask them what they want, it actually becomes a really important process for them, and it's healing. And it's really, they take on that responsibility to be the protector and provider, and they really lean into therapy. And I can talk, about my personal experiences as a therapist and the real, depth of feeling that men are able to bring when they are given space to do so. But it doesn't look and feel exactly as we're kind of taught. The way that men emote and communicate about things, when it comes to vulnerability, for instance, it can look and feel really different to what we'd expect in a woman, for instance. And there shouldn't be a necessity for us to reach this threshold of what distress should kind of look like. We need to have a really diverse understanding and view of the fact that a young guy is probably going to grunt at me for the first 2 or 3 sessions before he, respects me or trusts me. And his expression or understanding of what's going on for him is going to look really, really different to a young woman. And that's okay. And it'll also look different to a totally different young guy, a migrant, who's just come to Australia, or a bisexual guy who's, grappling with his sexuality. There's all of these different things that we need to take into account and break down these ideas of one size fits all. Anyone who's on this call who is a man themselves or has a man in their lives will know that men are very happy to talk if you provide them the right topic in the right space and the open ear to do so. And then another thing around the idea that men only want to see male clinicians. I'm sure there are plenty of hopefully female clinicians on the call tonight who work with men in various places, and they'll know that that's just not true. Women can be just as incredible at connecting with men. In fact, women often have, such good objective lived experience of kind of seeing the ways in which men connect with one another, that they have really good lessons to impart. So the key around, male or female therapists is really around preference, which is that there are certain young guys who actually, young men typically prefer to see women, and middle-aged men and up tend to prefer to see male clinicians. And, I think that we just need more options. So, as I said, we're getting this as a result of all of these myths that kind of are everywhere, and clinicians kind of perpetuate this stuff as well, let alone us in the community. You add to that the fact that we're getting this dropout rate, which is that the men are coming in to treatment, but 45% in this study that I ran in 2020 dropped out of treatment prematurely without telling their therapist that they were leaving. I'm sure that there are many people on this call who've done that. I've done that before, where I was just like, this isn't a good fit, I'm out. And that's a really important statistic, because it's costing us so much time and effort. And if you're a mother or a wife, who's dragged a man kicking and screaming into therapy, you want to make sure that it fits. You want to make sure that it works, because the toll in getting the man there, and the man themselves getting there, that amping themselves up to be in that room, and it not working is a real sense of failure. And what we end up with, which is really concerning to me, is this pessimism around the health system, which is that so many men go, all right, this shit doesn't work for me, I'm not doing it again. And so when things get really bad in future and crisis, arises, they go, I did therapy once, I did that thing, that woman who just spoke at me, I'm not going back. And that bias is when we end up with really harmful outcomes in the long term. So we keep telling men to open up. That's the narrative that goes on. It's what Movember did for a very long time. We're starting to now shift, thankfully, into looking at systems and services to try and go, wait a second, if 4,000 men that we surveyed globally, of them, 41% regretted opening up about their mental health, then you can't just say be more vulnerable. You can't just say, hey guys, just open up, all will be fine if you do so. Because are we actually ready to listen? Do we have a workforce? Do we have friends and family who are able to provide the type of support that men need? I'm not sure that we do. And so in the same way that we're dealing with domestic violence right now, and we're saying, everyone come forward if something is going on. We put ads on TV, we teach, boys and girls in school about this stuff. If you have a pipeline of people coming forward and you do not have the services to respond, or services that are quality and safe and successful in actually responding to this stuff, then you should not be asking in the first place for people to come forward. And so that's what I think we've kind of dealt with for a long time, which is that we've been doing these awareness campaigns over and over again. We have cupcake days every year where we're like, let's have a conversation. And then it kind of, just dies down. And those people who are left with this type of resentment towards these movements, because they've tried to have conversations, but it's fallen on deaf ears and it really hasn't hit the spot for them. And they become increasingly resentful about anyone's ability to help them. And that's a really bad place for us to be in. And the number of young men that we're dealing with online who feel that way, who feel like a system has failed them, that's a really, really tough situation. This wouldn't be a presentation without a quote from Brene Brown, who is an incredible sociologist in the States. She's worked with she works with the army a lot around vulnerability there, and she said that men are often pressured to open up and talk about their feelings and criticized for being emotionally walled off. But if they get too real, they're met with revulsion. There is this idea, and I had a couple a few years ago when I was doing couples therapy with them, and And there was this discussion where I asked, uh, you know, the woman in the relationship, you know, how do you tend to respond when you want to have a conversation with him? And she kept saying, I just want him to open up more. I want him to share what's going on. And then he said, yeah, but I did that the other day and I started crying and you told me that's enough. And so we need to understand all of these stereotypes, all of these norms around masculinity that kind of, umbrella above all of us. Um, they impact all of us, and we need to make sure that we are aware of our biases, aware of our attitudes around what we expect of men. And we cannot do this um, dichotomous behavior in a way, which is like, oh, I want you to do this, but actually I want you to do the opposite in certain circumstances, because it leads to a shutdown. It leads to an emotional shutdown. And that's what we see so often in guys, which is like, I'm not gonna do it. It's not worth it. So where does masculinity fit in all of this? My favorite topic. Well, the status bro. We start out with a young boy. We start out with a boy filled with capacity and love and an emotional spectrum that, rivals any girl. There's the boy's ability for tantrums is probably greater, according to the literature. They have love, they have anger, they have joy, they have sadness. All of it is there. And slowly over time, it gets beaten out of them, to be honest with you. There's this incredible research by a colleague of mine in the States called Judy Chu, who, followed a group of preschoolers from age 4 to 6 and watched as their depth of feeling when they were 4 slowly reduced. And they didn't only lose sadness and crying, for instance, but many of these boys actually lost joy and happiness. They started to look around and see how others related to them and see how their parents related to them and shut down their emotions. And over time, what happens is that when we all have internalizing situations, we all have these internal feelings of pain and suffering that happen. It's a human condition, and that's completely normal. But when they're not allowed, when they make you feel ashamed of yourself, when they get repressed and pushed down, that's when we get really problematic outcomes. That's when they explode, and that's when you get all of this externalizing symptomatology. So there's a reason that women are far more likely to present with depression, anxiety, and men are much more likely to present with alcohol and other drugs, with violence, with anger, with ADHD, all of these behavioral situations, because those internal experiences aren't accepted, and so they blow up and they come out. The bucket overflows. If we can find a way to get our young men to be able to accept, to regulate, to understand, and to communicate their internal experience, everyone will benefit for sure. So traditional masculinity is kind of sold in this way, which is that you have to be invulnerable. You've never tasted tears. You're devoid of femininity. You're a tower of strength. You're aggressive, forceful, and daring. I just read this, this idea of what this really rigid idea of what masculinity should be, and it's exhausting. And there are so many young men that are viewing content that is perpetuating this idea of what they should be. And all it does is inbuild a sense of failure, because you'll never get to this, nor should you want to. And it will also lead to all of your relationships failing, and it will lead to you distancing yourself from friends and family. And we've dealt with, 100 years of this type of prevailing idea of what masculinity should be, that we're starting to actually break down now. And we're not saying that you need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we need to understand that certain times require different responses. And having a really rigid idea of gender is so harmful. Instead, you need to have flexibility. So when a fireman is running into a fire, I need him to be stoic as hell. I need him to be self-reliant. I need him to be powerful and strong. Those are fundamentally important facets of his masculinity. But when he comes out and he's debriefing and is sitting with his colleagues and something's gone wrong, he needs to be able to access his emotional life. He needs to be able to access, softness. And we can have all of these things. They don't need to be exclusive. So those are some of the traditional masculine norms around being a leader, toughing it out. We've all seen these before, but that's what they're called. They're called norms. And so over time, becoming a man has become synonymous with a loss of friendship, a loss of intimacy and vulnerability. And we end up with lots of men who are lonely, deficient, and broken. And, you just have to go on Twitter to kind of see how this is playing out. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of senses of failure and taking it out on others. And trying to find ways to connect these men, is hard when there's not a lot of empathy or compassion for them because of their behaviors, the ways in which they're connecting with the world, which is often very harmful. But we will never solve this issue unless we find a way to reach in and call these men in rather than call them out. So, as this 64-year-old guy told me, we're told to be 10 foot tall and bulletproof. The ideal man should be someone who exemplifies the value of bravery, strength, and justice, balanced effortlessly with mercy. Good fucking luck. And it's this balancing act. It's this constant treadmill moving towards goalposts that are constantly shifting, that makes men feel, like nothing is good enough. And so we end up with a media landscape like this. If any of you are reading the ABC, the Guardian, it doesn't matter what it is. There is an article every day about young men, about masculinity, about what is going on in the world. And it's alarmist, it's crisis driven, and it doesn't offer any solutions. All it does is say that things are really bad, and no one is actually saying we should maybe talk to and connect with these guys. It's talking at them. It's talking about them, but it's not talking with them. And that's what we try to do at Movember, is connect on the ground with men in the places and spaces that make sense to them, rather than doing all of this spamming at them about how everything is broken, and how they shouldn't be like this and they shouldn't act like this. It's a failed exercise. It has not led to any change in the way in which men are engaging with other men or women and girls. It's just, we need to be pragmatic and we need to shift our approach, because the mental health outcomes are not any better, and the, violence and the addiction and all of this stuff, these numbers are staying pretty stagnant despite, this attempt to shine a light on this crisis. And that's because masculinity needs a rebrand. Young men don't engage with this stuff. They see themselves being spoken about, and then they go off and they watch the Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogans of the world, and they start to reinforce this us versus them mentality, which is really, really harmful. And so of the 2,000 guys that we surveyed, 50% of them describe being a man in a purely stereotypical form, this traditional idea that I need to be a breadwinner, for instance. And that's because they haven't had anyone else telling them any other narrative. Because there's either go to this place called the Manosphere, which is on TikTok and Twitter and Reddit and all of these, deep, dark places where you can it's become so mainstream now to kind of hear about masculinity in this way of like, take back power, let's be dominant, find your way to be successful, buy a Lamborghini, all of that type of stuff. They go there, or they read the traditional media who is telling them that everything is broken. And there's actually no other reimagined masculinity that they can kind of aspire towards. And so 20% of the rest of this population of 2,000 guys said, I don't know, or I don't care. And that's even more concerning, the passivity, the idea that it's not of concern to them because it's just such an annoying conversation, like a mosquito in their ear, is something we're really trying to shift. And this is what the guys told us. Masculinity is a dirty word. It's not something I want to align with. I never learned about this shit. That may have helped. And let's be honest, when you say masculinity, there's a hidden toxic in front of it, isn't there? I'm sure this will come up in the question time. I talk a lot about toxic masculinity and my lack of interest, might you say, in the term. So we can chat about that if anyone has any questions about that. So many men are struggling to be their true selves. They don't know how to engage with the world. They see everything as being very gray, and so they return to the black and white. When in fact, what we want is this public and private masculinity, this idea of how you present yourself outside and inside, being much more flexible and being much more fluid, because there are so many different ways of being a man, and all of those exist within us. And they might be contradictory, but we shouldn't succumb to this idea that we need to be one thing all the time. And that's where this idea of the perception gap comes in, which is my favorite piece of research that we've done, which is that men's internal experiences, men's values, men's idea of who they are and who they should be is often at odds with who they think what society thinks they should be. So if you ask a guy, a real man should have as many sexual partners as he can, we've still got, say, 17% of young men who are saying, yep, I think that that's true. But when you ask them what society thinks, they say 27% of them say that I think that that's what I should be as a man. That gap, these gaps that are around 10 to 15%, and they're bigger in some questions, that's the discomfort that men feel. That's the locker room chat that we see, where you've got a group of men who are sitting around. None of them have they all have respectful values towards women, for instance, but some guy says a misogynistic joke and all the others go, oh, maybe this is just how it is. This is how society works. This is what I've been told. I'm going to repress my own values. And that discomfort is just so problematic. But over time, they lose sight of themselves. And that's really sad. And so this idea that it's hard to do anything right as a man in the world, and that, it's so complicated compared to previous generations, we need to find a way forward for guys to actually be able to engage with the world in a safe way where they can be challenged, but they can be open for discussion and debate. So healthy masculinities are not attained. And this is the thing that is so important compared to traditional ideas, which are like, you need to fight for it. You need to go out and grab it from someone. They're pursued consistently. It's an ongoing journey through self-development and reflection, with one's agency, drive, and desire as central pillars. There is no such thing as success or failure. It is about learning. It is about relationships. It is about connection. And that is what we should be redefining masculinity towards. And here are some, I know I've thrown a lot of concepts at you all. Hopefully one of them will stick. Here are a couple of ideas that kind of permeate, the healthy masculinities model, that are around belonging. We talk about social isolation and loneliness, which is huge. Men go to gangs, men go to the dark web, men go and engage with, drug culture, for instance, as a means to try and connect, to find community. We need to find better ways. When the scouts and church and all of the traditional things that used to exist have kind of broken down as social structures, we need to find a way to connect young men with one another. And if it's online, then so be it. But we need to have healthy places, that they can interact with one another. Independence is obviously really key. Authenticity is something, that's what the perception gap is about: being your true self, finding out who your true self is and what your values are. And generosity. Altruism is fundamental to Movember's success over the years. So we've raised over $1 billion in 20 years because men are willing to help each other, are looking out for each other. The one thing that every man says when they fundraise for Movember, the 6 million plus guys who've done it, they don't want the money to go back to people who look like them. They want it to go to other men in other communities who really need it. So what we want is to stop this idea of reinforcing stereotypes. We want to get to the point where, instead of saying men just want practical advice or banter, there's all of this idea of, it doesn't matter what organization we work for, whenever we start to put a gendered lens on something, whenever we start to wrap things for a male audience, they very quickly revert back to this reductive stereotype of what men want, how it should be. And it's always the banter. It's you know, going in ways that are really simplistic and let's provide practical advice rather than listening and learning. We need to move away from that. The idea that we can only reach men in school and footy clubs and the pub. It's like the amount of clients who come to me and they're like, "Oh, I really want to connect with my friends, but I don't want to drink anymore. What do I do?" And I'm like, how are these options not open to you? You know, we need to open up the ways of being, the ways of connecting for men so that they can go into different places and spaces and look after themselves and one another. Of course, we need to stop saying men won't seek help. The idea that we need to stop speaking, speak to men's rationality rather than their emotionality. It's like all of these rules, there is a certain subgroup of guys who require that. Yeah. I work with a lot of veterans. I work with a lot of fireys. There's a certain time and place to use these things, but we need to get beyond that. We need to understand that in fact the guys that we're connecting with have a depth of feeling, and when we lock them into that way of being, it's something I remember working with this guy. He walked in, he's a really big Maori guy. He was a bikie, he's got tats everywhere. And I was like, it's so easy to lean into that bro-y type response. That's my own bias. And there's so many biases that all clinicians kind of have where we try to suss out who is the person sitting in front of us and what type of approach they want. But the natural tendency to lean towards, I'm going to connect with him on this level rather than this level. I decided that day because I just happened to have done a workshop that morning that I was going to offer a totally different version of myself that was probably very uncomfortable, but was not going to box this guy in. And so instead of being really bantery and joking around, I was really soft, and I took a much more emotionally led response. And I've never had a man cry more in a session. He, told me stories about his trauma background, which he'd never shared with anyone. And it's because I provided that space, and rather than leaning into my natural tendency, which was like, oh, let's connect on this level, I let him lead it. I let him tell me where he wanted it to go. So I think we always need to question that. Um, Presenting harmful behaviors as masculine, presenting risk taking as masculine, I just don't think that that's useful. In the same way that I don't think that using the term toxic masculinity is going to get us anywhere, because the very men we need to engage when it comes to toxic behaviors are running for the hills when they hear that term. So how are we ever going to make change? So what do we need to start doing? Obviously, you're all here, so researching and educating ourselves on the depth and diversity of men's experiences, seeing this is a systemic issue. It's a health system issue. It's an education system issue. It's not an individual's job. I always say, we don't expect a man coming in, to see a physiotherapist and the physio goes, sorry, I can't work with that knee. That knee doesn't really work for me. If you could just go find someone else. That's what happens in therapy sometimes. Men feel like their needs, like their approach to discussing their inner lives is just not okay. It's foreign, it's unaccommodating, and it's not accepted. And that requires, systems level change. It is not on men to adapt to our care. It's making sure that the system actually adapts to men. And we need to co-create solutions to do that. We need lived experience. We need men of all shapes and sizes. We need women who are working with and collaborating and living with and loving men to share their experiences. Role models don't only mean people as well. It means models of behavior. across society, media, and culture. If there are men in your life, in your work, we need to amplify those narratives. I'm done with the Trumps and the Weinsteins on the front page. That is not men and masculinity. There is so much more that we need to amplify. And we need to offer a clear and unambiguous blueprint of modern manhood around health and well-being and connection that is fundamentally, based on what you can be, what you can do, rather than don't do this, don't be this, because it's the shaming and blaming and distancing which is really alienating the very audience that we really want to connect with. Instead, let's find a way to call them in. And that means taking a strength-based empowerment narrative, telling them what they can do, giving them, opportunities for capacity and growth and purpose. That's what men are going to these, influencers for. They want advice. They want to find ways to date, to make money, to get a job. We can find other ways to give them better information to have those conversations. So, strength-based communication, embracing altruism, going to where men are, and not in the stereotypical sense, promoting diversity of healthy masculinities. Each of us have it in us. If you are a father, tell your son and show your son all of your ways of being. Show your daughter all of the different parts of yourself. Do not hide them and only show your wife. Do not hide them and only show your mates. All of those need to exist. And we need to show the next generation the complexity, the pain, the joy, the spirit in multiple ways of existing as a man. Appealing to men's better nature through social connection. Let's find way. That's all men want, is to belong and to connect and to find that sense of purpose. So let's lift that up. And I think that what we really require is just seeing opportunities and hope. And so I love this picture because these guys are hilarious. Jonah Hill is now problematic, but the others are still good. And this idea around stop assuming and start asking is really around hope, is really around listening to voices in our community, listening to elders, listening to, our grandparents, and starting to understand from our young people as well, what do they need? What are they experiencing? What are they feeling? And how can we go about actually plugging some of those holes in their lives with solutions that they want, that they will engage with, not just what we think they want. So that is all from me. This is a really important study that we're doing at the moment that I just wanted to spruik very quickly at the end. We keep talking about TikTok, what's going on TikTok? How are young men engaging with this? Oh my God, it's so frightening. No one's actually quantified what's going on. No one's actually looked into young men's experiences of what's happening on TikTok. So at Movember, my team is now running a study with men 16 to 25 to speak to them about what they're watching, to actually explore their TikTok data itself. They'll get $100 for taking part. And I would love if you have any young men in your lives, if you work at a school, if you've got sons, if you've got nephews, please share this around because it is so hard to engage with young men and we want to hear their lived experience. We want to hear what's going on for them. So if you can scan the QR code and share it far and wide this week, that would be really great because fundamentally what is required, for the Movember movement, but for the men's mental health sector more broadly, is to actually gain an understanding of what is happening in men's lives, how diverse it looks, and what they actually want as solutions. That's what we're trying to do from now on. Thank you. That's all from me. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zach. That was fantastic. We have got a couple of questions that have popped into the Q&A. I will start with one question. What's your view on the role of men's groups and gatherings?
Great question. So the men's health sector more broadly has come from the men's groups and gatherings space. That's where this whole thing began. men's sheds in Australia are an incredible organization. They are like the backbone of the men's health world. I think that my issue with the men's group situation is the splintering, which is that uh, there are so many of them popping up all over the shop, and it's kind of a waste of resource in many ways, which is that um, they all have their own marketing campaign. Every council has their own kind of group that's going on. They're all got a charity gala dinner, and they're not actually sharing knowledge with one another. So our aim at Movember is to try and be the big brother for all of these and be, a research repository of like what works, and to make sure that the evidence is kind of funneling down because everyone is well intentioned, but it can get pretty full on when you've got really intense mental health difficulties and these guys are showing up and you're not a trained clinician. You're just a guy who's really interested in helping other guys. We just want to make sure that there are the right supports in place and that there's not a doubling up of effort and resource when in fact they're a really powerful mechanism for change when done properly.
Thank you for that answer. Um, we've got another question with softness and gentleness as masculine qualities, balancing out hardness and toughness. How do you learn it?
Um, Great question. Um, so there's an incredible group called She Is Not Your Rehab on Instagram that I highly recommend checking out. They're a New Zealand group. He's a Maori guy who wrote a beautiful book about his own trauma history and about doing the work and around how he came through the other side, where, the likelihood of him harming himself or harming others was, through the roof given the experiences that he'd had. But I think that what's really important is that he was able to make that leap into a willingness to be something different and to break the cycle. And I think that that's the motivation that I often talk to men about, which is that, if we're talking about violence prevention, which is something that, is a very topic very close to my heart, and I see it as a men's mental health issue at the moment. When you talk to any man in a behavior, change program, any guy who's been violent towards his family and um, you know, there is no desire to do that. It comes from a place of pain. It comes from a place of suffering and experience that the need for dominance and control kind of plays out. And that, as I talked about before, that externalizing symptomatology, that externalizing thing where I can't deal with my own emotions, I can't regulate it, it just explodes out of me and I take it out on others. So I just think that talking to these guys about what they are capable of who they can be, and realizing the fact that that softness is life-saving for them, I think is the way forward.
Great. We have got a question with Victorian government's appointment of Parliamentary Secretary for Men's Behaviour Change. Is it a step in the right direction?
Yeah, great question. I've been thinking a lot on this in the past few days. I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. Whether or not it leads to change is always up for debate, and we'll see how that goes. But the very fact that we're starting to go, oh, domestic violence, men's behavior change, that is a core element of this. I was saying before that if we are to shift these statistics when it comes to female homicide or otherwise, dealing with women's lives and their behaviors is pure risk reduction. Dealing with men's behavior is violence prevention. It's a band-aid solution to put more onus on women to somehow fix this situation, when in fact it is fundamentally about men's lives, their experiences, their trauma, their addictions. That is what needs to be treated and dealt with early, and that is what is going to lead to a shift in this whole narrative. And so I hope that the appointment, of Tim in that role is going to lead to at least a narrative shift in the way in which we're willing to lift up this idea that we can focus on men and it's not excusing their behavior.
Great. We also would like to know if we could get the QR code shared again for that study in the chat,
Sure.
or in some way we can distribute that across everybody. I can
Definitely.
also get that sent out to everybody after this.
I will get you the link.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And we have, what resources specifically for men can you recommend, especially making deeper connections or avoiding loneliness, or any books?
Mm. There's so many. Here is the link. Let me send it to everyone. There we go. Tech, how good is this? There's the link. Uh,
Thank you.
cheers, guys. There are so many podcasts, going around at the moment. Obviously, The Imperfects is a great Melbourne-based podcast that does incredible stuff um, around connection and dealing with vulnerability and dealing with your own failures and realizing that they're a great opportunity for growth. She Is Not Your Rehab, as I said, is awesome. The book that he's written is so raw, and that's what I really love. I don't want these to be these really glossied kind of, view of the world that's kind of like, I got through this and let me tell you all of the great things that I did. It needs to be raw and real. And so I think that so many guys kind of do that. I'll have a think about other books along the way. I've worked with Hunter Johnson at the Man Cave, who's an incredible guy, who I'm sure many of you know. He had a podcast that I was on called Stuff. And I've been on Dill Buckley's podcast as well, which is great. He talks about mental health a lot as well. So it's trying to realize who is the guy, who is the audience, and what interests them, rather than trying to retrofit it. And then I think trying to get, some topics, because there's so much of this stuff going around that is really targeted towards them. But I think what's important is that there's a lot of crap as well. Um, and like some of the most famous guys in this space at the moment, like Andrew Huberman, who's apparently a neuroscientist. But there's just millions and millions. Joe Rogan has millions and millions. And this is the thing, it's like this is mainstream stuff. So we need to realize what it is people are actually listening to and watching and reading, and how can we find ways to offer, stuff that's actually going to hopefully, increase their literacy in this world.
Yes. We've got a question. So we've got a panelist from Lilydale. They have 2 to 3 new approaches to mentoring men, both group and individual, and they totally support everything you've said about the groups, and have tried to bring it up into their community. It worked for a while, but it's faded in the last 18 months. So now organisations from New South Wales who have little ideas about what exists and the nature of the outer eastern community, and they're trying to bring them together so they see the complementary resources who ought to be working together.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the thing, you know, there are so many of these groups that have a huge start, and it's like every, and this is kind of, it's great to be on a council call, because councils do this all the time. They don't look at what's happening next door. I worked at Macedon Rangers. We did a project, and I've done, projects in various jurisdictions in New South Wales as well. And it's like the double up is crazy. So it's like we need better synthesis of ideas. And you get this thing, you get a really passionate guy who's running the thing, and he comes in, and then they get funding, and then it expands really quickly, and they don't have the infrastructure to do anything with it. And then suddenly it dies down and vanishes, when 20 or 30 guys were so reliant upon that for their connection. So I do think that finding a means for maintaining and sustaining that type of group is really important, and it shouldn't just be, something that is founder led, if that makes sense.
We have a question. So, what can we do as single mothers who have escaped family violence to educate and teach our young sons? And so, one panelist has mentioned their son is 8 years old and the father has all the defining traits of coercive control, misogynist views, and gendered stereotypes. So, how could that be something to approach?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, and sorry for what you're going through, and I'm sure your son is very lucky to have you. What's really important is to branch out and expand the types of influences that they have. We talk about role models, but as I said, it's about the types of models of behavior that they're willing to see. It's not about individuals per se, but it's very important to find teachers and uncles and, you know, other men that they can see that this isn't how it has to be. This boy may always have an interaction with his father, he may not, but knowing that there are other models of manhood out there, because so many guys think, oh, this is what it is, this is what it looks like, this is how it will be, and this is what I will become. And so reassuring them that no one is doomed to reenact what their father has done. If anything, it's the greatest opportunity to move elsewhere, to maneuver into a new way of becoming a man that, lives up to all of the values that you bestow upon him. So I think that is really important, to show a diversity of different ways of being, and to give him access to his own emotional experience. It'll be really full on, I'm sure, and the way in which young boys especially tend to, externalize, as I said, all of these feelings that they're having, but it's sitting with that and not shutting it down, I think, which is really important.
We've got another question. So, how do I safely advocate for men when there's such strong social pressure against men's advocacy?
That's a cool question. Welcome to the club. So, yeah, I cop it. I cop it across the board. I cop it if I'm talking about domestic violence and trying to shift men's behavior. I cop it if I'm talking about male suicide and trying to empathize with men's experiences. It doesn't matter which side you go on. You talk about men and masculinity. Yeah, it's a tough place to be. But it's worth it. And the way to kind of go about it is to always put the health and well-being of not only men, but the narrative that Movember use fundamentally is healthy men, healthy world. So that's the angle that really gets everyone across the line, which is that you're not there to advocate, and this is the really important thing. There's a difference between a men's rights activist and a men's advocate. I'm advocating for men and boys because I believe in their potential for growth and change and self-betterment, but not at the cost of others. I'm not there to take away funding from women's health or women's violence sector. I'm there to expand the pie. I'm there to offer a new solution. I'm there to offer a new lens on the fact that if this stuff is taking place in men's lives, we need to be focusing on them as a part of the solution, for instance. So taking a strength-based angle is the best way to do this stuff. And it's seeing men as a vehicle for growth and change in their community, to look after themselves and look after others.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. We're going to have to wrap it up here. We've reached our hour, but with any questions that have been unanswered, we can try and get some responses to those and send them out to the group. Would like to thank you once again, Zach, for your time this evening. It's been absolutely insightful and a great way to bring awareness around Men's Health Week as well in this space. It's been a really big insight to men's mental health, the masculinity, as well as everything around the gender lens and the also the suicidality of men's mental health. So that's been very deeply interesting tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for joining us this evening.
Thanks all.